Okay, we are live. All right. So, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our June Lunch and Learn about the economic impacts on Westmoreland County from the natural gas industry. I'm Natalie Ford, the project coordinator for Protect PT, and I will be your host today. And joining me today is Sean O'Leary from the Ohio River Valley Institute. And without further ado, I will go ahead and read his bio so you can get a little clue in on who he is, what he's about, and what he's doing here today. So, Sean O'Leary, senior researcher of energy and petrochemicals, is a native of Wheeling, West Virginia, who is now located in Washington, I found out. He has written about coal, natural gas, and their role in the economics of Appalachia in a book, a newspaper column, and blog titled The State of My State. Previously, Sean served as communications director at the Northwest Energy Coalition in Seattle, Washington. And so now he is with the Ohio River Valley Institute. And yeah, we're going to be discussing a report that he helped create on the economic impacts of the natural gas industry in Westmoreland County, which is super applicable to our base with Protect PT, seeing that we serve largely Westmoreland County. So this is really exciting stuff. So welcome, Sean. How are you today?
I'm great. Thanks, Natalie. And thanks everyone for attending. This is kind of interesting because, as Natalie mentioned a moment ago, we have a report that is coming out, as in won't come out for about another 3 weeks. And so you guys are kind of getting a sneak preview of the report that we're going to have coming out, which examines the impacts of the Appalachian natural gas boom on economies generally in the Appalachian region, but it also drills down on a county by county basis, and that includes Westmoreland County, to examine what those impacts are and also what they're likely to be going forward as we deal with some new forces that are at work in our region. And when I say new forces, I'm talking about things like data center development and liquefied natural gas and other things. So, Billy, if we could go to the first slide. And in fact, let's go to the second slide. Sorry. Okay. So, what we're going to talk about today, again, as Natalie mentioned, is first, we're going to talk about the economic impacts of the natural gas industry on a region that we have termed, and over the last 5 years, it's become just kind of an accepted term, a region called Frackalacha. And Frackalacha is specifically a group of 30 counties in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia that produce about 95% of all of the natural gas that comes out of the region. And the reason that we're looking at these counties as a collection is because, as you'll see in the presentation that I'm about to give, they have some very unique and even perverse economic impacts of counties that are very heavily involved and, in some cases, even dominated by the natural gas industry. So we'll be taking a look at that. And then, as I mentioned before, we're also going to be looking ahead. We'll drill down, look at Westmoreland County, and specifically we'll look at the composition of Westmoreland County's economy and the role that natural gas is playing there and that it may play going forward. And then we'll look ahead to, as I said before, some of these other forces that are coming into play in our region. And the two that seem to be getting a lot of attention from people right now are data centers and liquefied natural gas. We'll also talk a little bit about the Arch 2 hydrogen hub for those who are interested, although it may not be there to talk about for very much longer. So we'll come back to that. But I'm also going to ask you guys to do something kind of weird and kind of special. As we go through this presentation, which looks at economic issues, I'd love for you to do it pretending that you just don't give a damn about the environment, about public health, about anything other than jobs and business. And the reason that I'm asking you to look at these issues through that particular lens is that by the time we come to the end of the presentation, I would like you to be able to ask yourselves, even if you were in this mode where you didn't care about any of these issues, would you want to try to build Westmoreland County's economy on the back of the natural gas industry? So that's the question we'll come back to at the end. But in the meantime, try to suppress all of those environmental urges that you may have. And let's just pretend you're Joe Sixpack. You care about jobs, you care about local economy, and it doesn't even matter about that environmental stuff. Billy, if we could hit the next slide. Okay, so here is Frackalacha. It's a group of 30 counties, that I said before, that are clustered in the upper Ohio River Valley. And also, you see that cluster of 6 counties up in northeast Pennsylvania. And the distinction between the red counties and the blue counties is an interesting one, and it's an important one. And that is that the blue counties that you see are the original Frackalacha from the year 2020 when we did our first Frackalacha report. What has happened since then is that the natural gas industry has expanded. And so it used to be that those blue counties, of which there were 22 at the time, collectively produced about 91, 92% of natural gas. But because of industry expansion, you now have to throw in 8 additional counties to get up over that 90% mark. And so each of the counties that you see highlighted here produces at least 50 million cubic feet per year of natural gas. And some of them, and specifically Susquehanna County, up in the northeast part of the state, actually produces over 1 billion cubic feet a year. But these are all major natural gas producing counties. And as I said before, they are basically the Appalachian natural gas industry. If we could hit the next slide, Billy. So this is our 5th report on the economic impacts of natural gas development in the region. The common thread through all of the reports that we have, going back to the very first one from, it was not published until 21, it was researched in 2020. The common denominator going through all of these reports is that the natural gas boom has had an immense impact on the region's economies when you look at economic output as measured by gross domestic product. And as many of you probably know, GDP is kind of the catch-all measure of economic activity. It accounts for all commerce, excuse me, the sale of goods, investment, everything. And generally speaking, it kind of serves as a thumbnail or shortcut to, hey, how's this region doing economically? But as you'll see in the coming slides, Frackalacha has a very unusual characteristic economically, and that is that as it grows and as it seems to prosper, as measured by GDP, local measures of prosperity, things like jobs and income, don't grow nearly as much. The other point that I'd like to make about this 5th Frackalachian report, and this one does distinguish it from some of the others, is that we're now pretty far along in the Appalachian natural gas boom. The baseline year for our reports is 2008. So we're now 17 years into this gas boom. And as many of you will recall, the gas boom was heralded originally as that it would be a great economic game changer, a bringer of jobs and prosperity. And, frankly, all you got to do is kind of look around. You don't have to be an economist to see that most of the communities in the region have not exactly prospered. And so much of what we're working on is to try to understand both why that is happening, but also to take the lessons from that history and see how they apply to some of the forces going forward. So, Billy, if you could hit the next slide. Now, as I mentioned, you don't have to be an economist to know that most of the communities in our region have not been thriving economically, that jobs have not been expanding, and that's quite stunning when you consider the backdrop. Going back to the year 2010, and then basically almost every year since then, we have been the subjects of economic impact studies, many of them sponsored by the petroleum industry. And almost invariably, they make incredibly grandiose pronouncements about the number of jobs that are being supported by oil and gas and how the economy is growing and the opportunities that it's bringing. And that narrative is so pervasive that, frankly, politicians of all political persuasions at this point have pretty much bought into it. Everybody seems to be in agreement that fracking, in particular, and the natural gas industry are key elements to Pennsylvania's economy and to growth in the region and to opportunity. And it is so much the case that in the last presidential election, you guys, I say you guys because I'm sitting here in Washington state right now, you guys in Pennsylvania were inundated by advertising from the campaigns, which reinforced this. This is from a McCormick ad, but the Trump campaign and other campaigns emphasized the centrality of the natural gas industry. And frankly, so does Josh Shapiro. And so do many Democrats in the region. This is not a partisan issue, at least in their minds. Everybody seems to kind of hearken to the call that natural gas is a vital economic component of what's happening in Pennsylvania. And I know this because we have this history of reports. During the last presidential campaign, I started getting calls from reporters who do fact checking. And I was called about this particular ad. I was also called by the Washington Post about Trump ads that claimed that 500,000 jobs in Pennsylvania depend on the industry. And I had to be honest with them, and you'll see this in a moment. The actual number of jobs in the fracking industry in Pennsylvania is 18,636. There are more hairdressers in Pennsylvania than there are workers in the fracking industry. Okay? So let's just put that marker in the ground right now. And Billy, if we could go to the next slide. And so here is an opportunity to see what I was talking about a few moments ago. The charts that you see measure two things. Over on the left-hand side, you see change in nominal GDP and nominal income. Okay, so what we're talking about is, again, I mentioned before that GDP, gross domestic product, is the measure of all economic activity in a particular place. And, and of course, income is the amount of money that residents in a particular place actually take home, that they actually realize. And so what you see over is that the chart on the left-hand side compares the United States and its rate of growth in GDP since 2008, before the fracking boom began, and it compares it to what happened in Ohio, the combined Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. And then finally, in the right, you get to Frackalacha. And so This will help us understand why Frackalacha is weird, and frankly, weird in a not very good way. If you look at the US numbers, you'll notice that, again, way over on the left, that between 2008 and 2023, the gross domestic product in the United States grew by just under 88%. And not coincidentally, if you look at the orange bar next to it, you'll see that income in the United States also grew by about 88%. And that's not unusual for reasons that should be fairly obvious. Um, it is generally speaking the case that income and GDP grow together. Why? Because anything that's produced has to be consumed. Someone has to buy it and every time that happens, somebody receives money. They receive income. So typically, you would expect GDP and income to be very close to one another. Now, there are some things that can separate them a little bit, but usually not very much. Like a couple of years ago, when we were in the throes of the COVID epidemic, and the federal government cut checks to everybody for a few $1,000s, that was income without any offsetting GDP. And so for a little while, we saw income grow faster than GDP. But it generally takes weird events like that to produce that outcome. And so when you go over to the next set of blue and orange bars, we're looking at Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. So we're combining the three economies of those states. And you'll notice that the level of growth in both GDP and income is substantially less than it is nationally. 88% for the nation, but only about 70% for the three states of Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. But again, they're together in terms of GDP and income. But then you go to the right hand set of bars for Frackalacha, the 30 counties that we started talking about a minute ago. And what you see is really weird. You see GDP that is not only better than Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia for the amount of growth, it's actually substantially higher than it is for the United States. If all that you were doing was using gross domestic product performance to try to figure out, gee, how is this place doing economically? Frackalacha would be a superstar in the nation's economy. We would be in great, great shape. But then you go over to the income bar, the little orange bar, and you see something else altogether. The little orange bar for income in Frackalacha is lower than it is. Not only is it lower than it is for GDP, it's lower than it is for either the United States or even Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. And so the anomaly, the characteristic that distinguishes Frackalacha is that the region produces a great deal of wealth that is injected into the nation's economy and in the form of income. The problem is that very little of that income actually lands in our communities, actually goes to you and to me, to residents in our region. And that disconnect between GDP growth and income growth produces a lot of pretty abysmal outcomes. And so when you look over at the chart on the right, which is percent change in population and jobs, you'll see what I mean. Between 2008 and 2023, the population of the United States, the blue bar on the left, grew by just over 10%. And the number of jobs in the US economy grew by over 13%. Now, in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, not as much. In fact, not real good. Jobs, population only grew by about 2%, and jobs only grew by about 4.5%. But of course, that's again somewhat consistent with the fact that there was, poorer GDP and poorer income as well. You would expect again the those trends to move together. But look at Frackalacha over on the right. And I want you to process this. The population of the Frackalachian counties far from growing like the rest of the nation did. And despite the fact that GDP has been going through the ceiling, has actually declined. Frackalacha has lost tens of thousands of people. And that's a phenomenon that you guys in Westmoreland and a lot of other counties in and around our region are very familiar with. And, it takes a very human form because what we're talking about in many cases, we're losing not just workers in the economy. I mean, we're seeing families broken up because people have to go to other places. Kids have to move to other places away from their family homes to find work. I mean, there's a real human element to this. And so while I'm a bit of a quant and I can live my life in a world of numbers, I don't want to lose sight of the human beings behind a lot of what we're saying. And so, what we're talking about is a 3% loss in population, and even the number of jobs has gone down in Frackalacha. Now, again, I'm saying this against the backdrop of just an avalanche of economic impact reports that are sponsored by the industry that keep driving home the point that the natural gas industry is a foundational element. It's an engine for job growth and economic prosperity. But in fact, what we're seeing is that in Frackalacha, in these counties that are experiencing great growth in terms of GDP, we're actually seeing overall economic decline. And I'm going to foreshadow the question, or at least repeat the question that I'll repeat once more at the end of this presentation, which is, do you think that the development of the natural gas industry is a foundational piece on which we want to premise our economic development as a county, as a state, and as a region? Because the folks in Harrisburg do. They believe this. They believe that when natural gas as an industry expands and grows, that it's producing beneficial economic results for the communities where it's concentrated. Billy, if we could hit the next slide. And so where population and incomes fall, guess what? Or population and jobs fall, so do incomes. And so in this chart, we see that since 2008, the US has seen about 88% income growth. There's Frackalacha down there at about 67%. We're falling farther behind. Okay, next slide, Billy. Okay, so here is the real toll that this is taking. This particular chart looks at the labor force. And what you'll see is that back in 2008, before the fracking boom began, the 30 Frackalachian counties had about 950,000 workers combined. Since that time, we have lost about 55,000 workers. And the reason that I emphasize that number and is that having a lousy unemployment rate is not fun. Unemployment isn't great. No one really likes it. But do you know what's worse than unemployment? Worse is losing workers, because when companies seek to expand and grow, one of the key elements that they look for in an economy is whether or not they can find workers who are qualified and sufficient in number to staff their businesses. And I will bet a lot of you know of places that are in your area that are looking for workers and can't find them, or can't find qualified ones, or can't find folks who, frankly, don't have drug histories or other issues. I mean, it is a real challenge for economic growth in our area, that even if we were able to acquire or attract companies, many of them would not or cannot find workers. And it's become a major issue in our region. Billy, if you could hit the next slide. And so we see that here because one of the claims that's often made by the industry is, hey, we must be doing a good job because unemployment rates in our area have gone down, compared to where they were back in 2008, and especially like in 2010 after the housing crisis and the Great Recession. Compared to those days, our unemployment rate is actually much lower than it used to be. Right now, we're at 3.7%. But it is, as the title of the slide suggests, a case of addition by subtraction. Usually, when you think about a declining unemployment rate, you say, hey, that's good. Declining unemployment rate means jobs are being created and people are being hired. But in little upside down Frackalachia, that's not how it works. In Frackalachia, our unemployment rate is going down not because we're adding jobs, but because we are losing workers even faster than we're losing jobs, which means we have the worst of both worlds. We've got declining employment and a declining workforce, which makes it harder to actually recover economically. So, Billy, if we could hit the next slide. And by the way, I want to mention, if anybody has any questions or comments that they'd like to have, please don't hesitate to interrupt me, or I'm sure Billy, drop something in the chat, because I know I'm throwing a hell of a lot of numbers at you, and it can get a little dense. So please stop me if we need to and take a break on this. Okay, now let's pivot to the gas industry itself. Again, one of the most frequent reactions that I get to the Frackalachia reports, which, by the way, have been reporting these same trends for the last 5 years, it's not like anything has changed. This has been the case since day one. The most common reaction that I get from people who are not particularly happy about the findings is, well, the natural gas industry is doing its job. It's creating jobs and it's creating opportunity. It's the rest of the economy that's going to hell in a handbasket. It's everything else that's screwed up. The gas industry is great. And actually, no. In the last 4 years, the natural gas industry has laid off 3 out of every 10 workers. The natural gas industry is losing jobs even faster than the rest of Frackalachia is. And that's largely because, the natural gas industry, like most industries, innovates and it becomes more efficient. And as it innovates and becomes more efficient, it needs fewer workers. And so in our communities, we once were seeing back in 2019 over $5 billion a year in income for natural gas workers. That's now dropped to about 3.7 billion. That's a big chunk to take out of economies in our region. And again, that's for the 3 states combined of Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. And so it's not just that, we're seeing fewer jobs, we're seeing less income injected into local economies. And that goes a long way toward explaining, frankly, why we can see an industry that is growing while at the same time the communities in which it's based are suffering and declining. Next slide, Billy. And so this basically summarizes it. When you look at the natural gas industry since 2019, its output, its growth is at about 24%, which is really big compared to the rest of the economy. But in that same time, the number of jobs and the number of wages have actually declined by 30%. Again, is this the industry on which you want to try to premise your economic recovery? Anyway, let's go to the next slide, Billy. Okay, so we can actually see the total paradox that I talked about, the paradox of rising GDP and plunging jobs and incomes, perhaps best in this chart, this combination of charts. One of the things that we did was, within that 30 counties that make up Appalachia, there are some counties, and Westmoreland is one of these, where although Westmoreland is a major gas producing county, because Westmoreland has such a big population and so much other economic activity, the natural gas industry actually makes up a relatively small part of it. It's about 3% of Westmoreland County GDP. Meanwhile, we've got other counties in Appalachia where it is not just over 20%. We've got counties where the natural gas industry is more than 50% of GDP. And so one of the questions that we asked ourselves was, well, gee, if the maybe, there are other forces at work in places like Westmoreland County, but if the natural gas industry was really an engine for jobs and prosperity, wouldn't you expect that in the counties where it's more prevalent, that they would be doing better than the counties where it's not as prevalent? And so we went into the 30 Appalachian counties and we divided them into two groups. One group was counties, and there are 12 of them, like Westmoreland, in which the natural gas industry is less than 20% of GDP. And there were 18 counties where it's more than 20% of GDP. And so what you find out is that in those counties where it's less than 20%, those 12 counties combined, its overall average was about 6.7% of GDP. In the counties where it's over 20%, the average there was 42% of GDP. These are counties where no other industry even comes close to fracking. In fact, once you get rid of government, fracking is half the entire economy. And if you go down, you notice in this chart at the top, you'll notice national nominal GDP change. You'll notice that in the counties where natural gas is less than 20%, GDP only grew by 94%. But in the counties where natural gas is a big component, GDP 140% growth. And you're looking at that and you're going, wow. And then you go to per capita GDP. How much wealth is being generated per person in these places? And you look at those where, fracking is less than 20% of GDP, and they're only generating about $71,000 a year per person. You look over in the counties where natural gas is more than 20% of GDP, they're at $88,000 a person. This is like great, right? By every standard measure, you would expect those counties to be doing really, really well. But then you get to per capita income. And all of a sudden, you see, okay, the ones that where fracking GDP is less than 20%, they're making $63,000 a year. But over in Appalachia, in the ones that are under or over 20% of GDP, they're only at $52,000 a year. And so what happens in the little line chart that you see below that? What you're seeing is that as the fracking industry grows as a share of your economy, the share of that growth that is realized in the form of income declines. And as you can see in that little like pincher, like looks like a pair of pliers, and the red line and the blue line are like mirror images of one another. That's the impact that fracking has on your economy. As fracking grows, incomes go down as a share of GDP. It's like it's like cause and effect. Next slide, Billy. Okay, so let's look at Westmoreland County. In light of everything that you've just seen, let's figure out what's going on with the gas industry in Westmoreland. Well, the first thing is, and I should mention, the next few slides that I'm going to show you are from a report that I prepared for Protect PT about a year and a half ago, and that were never used. Natalie, you may remember whatever it was they were for. It was for some hearing, and it was ultimately deemed irrelevant to the hearing, so they were never used. And so these slides, I should mention that these slides date to the year 2022 rather than the more recent 2023 data that we've been looking at so far. But they serve to make the same point. And that is, first of all, looking at GDP in Westmoreland County. You see a series of industries that are listed there that collectively make up 100%. This is Westmoreland County's economy, led by finance, insurance, manufacturing is up there, business services are up at the top of the list and kind of dominate the county in terms of share. You have to go all the way down to the little red bar, mining, quarrying, oil and gas extraction, which includes fracking, makes up 2.7% of Westmoreland County's economy. It's almost a rounding error. Now, I will say this, in the year since this, had I used 2023 data, it's now 3%. I'm actually rounding up from 2.99, but you get the idea. And so for those, first of all, just process that thought for a moment. When people talk about the importance of natural gas in the region and to Westmoreland County's economy, it's one of the smallest economic sectors. It's one of the smallest industrial sectors that the county even has. Next slide, Billy. Earnings. I'm sorry, we're jobs, excuse me. The number of jobs, you'll notice, we were just at about 2.7% on GDP. If you go down to that pink bar, you'll notice that in jobs, it's 0.8%. The reason that the jobs figure is smaller than the GDP figure is, as I mentioned earlier, natural gas production is one of the most capital intensive and least labor intensive activities in the entire economy. Overall, in the US economy, when a company takes in money, about 55% of the income that a company earns goes to pay employee wages and salaries. About 55% over the economy as a whole. In the fracking industry, it's less than 10%. And that's why when you hear these immense claims made about the level of investment that an industry is making in an area, you'll hear billions of dollars. And I'll give you an example. In the 8 Frackalachan counties in eastern Ohio, Cleveland State University runs a regular updated report on how much money has the natural gas industry invested in those counties. And the answer is, so far to date, since 2008, $108 billion. Almost none of which shows up as income for people in the area. Just doesn't make much difference. Billy, if we could hit the next slide. And so you get, I think, the idea of what's going on even within Westmoreland County. Not only have we seen that the gas industry isn't exactly a great economic engine to begin with, in Westmoreland County, it's almost negligible in size, which is kind of weird because this is the population of the 30 Frackalachan counties. And you see, Westmoreland County is the largest, and by quite a margin. Westmoreland County is 20% of all the population in Frackalaccha. And Frackalaccha's population, I should add, is a combined 1.85 million people, which, if it were a state, it would be the 39th largest state. Bigger than Idaho, or rather small, just behind Idaho and just ahead of West Virginia in population. So we're not talking about a trivial thing here. We're talking about a region that is as big in population and also in geography as many states. Now, Westmoreland is the largest Frackalachan county, but and you'll see, a number, all of the counties that are large on the left, you'll notice not coincidentally are in the Pittsburgh metropolitan area. So Washington and Butler pop up there too. Now, Billy, if you could hit the next slide. But when you look at the production of natural gas, you'll see Westmoreland's kind of like down there a little bit in the middle. It's in about the 40th percentile if you care about these things. The biggest one is Susquehanna County, where no one lives. Well, some people do, but not many of them. But boy, do they put out a lot of gas. And those two, so understanding that, population in Frackalaccha, population and output are not particularly closely correlated is kind of critical to understanding many of the statistics that we're going to see now, because what we're going to look at for Westmoreland County and for other counties is a breakdown of what's going on there in jobs, income, and population. So Billy, if you'll hit the next slide. Okay, so weak GDP growth. You'll see that the red bars in here represent Frackalaccha, the United States, and also the combined states of Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. And you'll notice that Frackalaccha is ahead of everybody else in GDP growth, which we saw earlier. What you see, though, even above the red Frackalaccha line, is look at the GDP growth of some of these places. It is just immense. 400, 500. These economies are 6 times the size of what they were before. But guess what, Billy, if you hit the next slide? If you look at the change in jobs, some of these counties that had GDP growth up in the hundreds, in terms of jobs, we're seeing double-digit losses in jobs. And you see Westmoreland County there is down about 4.5% in the period that we're talking about. And frankly, it would be worse. Westmoreland is frankly benefited by the fact that while it is now a Frackalachan county, the industry still isn't a big player in Westmoreland. If you want to go to places that have really serious job loss, you have to go to the ones down below Westmoreland, where they've got a much bigger gas industry relative to the rest of the economy. Billy, if you could hit the next one. And you see the same thing happening in income, where Frackalaccha trails the U.S. and state, but then you see that most of the Frackalachan counties are even below the Frackalaccha level in terms of income growth. And you see Westmoreland down there in the bottom quarter in terms of income growth. So Billy, next slide. And so finally, population, which frankly is the most dismal statistic of them all. And this is where you see Frackalaccha as a whole losing population, but look at the population losses in many of the counties. And frankly, and I said I wasn't going to talk at all about environmental stuff, but frankly, the population losses that you see, the 10, 15, 20% population losses in some of these places are to some degree attributable to the natural gas industry and the burdens that it places on people's health and quality of life. Billy, if you could hit the next slide. And so finally, I said that I'd mention about what's coming down the pike at us. We've heard about data centers and other things, and in fact, data centers are coming. And the reason that they're part of this presentation is, of course, that data centers are in our region going to be powered by, to a large degree, natural gas with new power plants that are being proposed all over the region. And the organization, PJM, that runs our electric grid anticipates growth that will require, between the retirement of existing plants that are just too old to operate and the need for new plants, they are expecting that we're going to have to build about 100 gas fired power plants in about the next 10 years. That is a lot of additional fracking. That's a lot of additional emissions. It's a lot of additional problems environmentally as well as economically for our region. Because one of the effects of that is, and if you could go to the next slide, Billy.
I actually have a question from a viewer, Sean, if you don't
Yeah,
mind if I
sure.
pop that in. So
No,
this is from Michelle. She is one of our board members, actually. So she is asking, how much does demographics impact the jobs numbers? Isn't the negative impacts you see driven by our very old population that have retired?
it is in part. However, I mean, so yes, that is absolutely a factor, but I would hearken you back to the labor force statistics. And that's why, this is specifically why I included the labor force statistics, to point out that labor force is dropping even faster than population is. And that indicates that we're seeing a decline in working age people as much as we are in folks who are older. Now, I mean, that can happen because, as folks get older, they retire. But the point then is they're still not being replaced. And so either way, it comes to, frankly, the same end. So, yeah, demographics absolutely have an impact, but also the absence of employment opportunities and other things that keep workers in a region is also very much at work. So, hope that answers it. Um,
Michelle
and so,
says thank you.
okay, so what happens with data centers and what do they mean to us? The bad news about data centers is that, like the natural gas industry itself, it is a highly capital intensive, not very labor intensive enterprise that employs very few people and therefore, like the natural gas industry, also injects very little in the way of money into the economy. At the same time, and this could be devastating, and you guys are going to see in your next utility bill, you're going to see it. Next electric bill, if you haven't already, it's coming. Data centers are going to significantly, and already are, driving up our electric rates, probably by about 15% in Westmoreland County, in the whole West Penn area. And I think West Penn serves most of Westmoreland County, doesn't it, Natalie? Yeah, okay. Um, so you're going to see significantly higher electric bills going forward. And so it's interesting because, while on the one hand, one of the reasons that local policymakers really like data centers and the natural gas industry is that they generate tax revenue. But what we're talking about is a situation where the additional tax revenue they generate is being offset by higher utility bills. In other words, you're still paying, it's just more of your money may go to the electric company than goes to taxes. And so the bottom line is that, with respect to data centers, they employ very few people. They're not going to inject much money into the economy because when they earn revenue, that revenue doesn't land locally. And as a result of that, and I mean, even, and I'll give you, for instance, like, many data centers require power plants to run them. And those power plants can be like you in Westmoreland, you've got the Tenaska power plant. The Tenaska power plant is a really big deal in terms of power generation, but guess what? It employs 30 people. It's the Tenaska power plant and most data centers like it are basically Olive Gardens without the good food in terms of economic impact. I mean, they just don't matter much, frankly. And so this is one of the reasons why you should be very skeptical and concerned about data center proliferation, because they're advertised as, turning the county into a tech hub, and we're going to have and people have visions of like office parks of workers and high-tech people earning big salaries, and it's like data centers are warehouses for servers. They don't employ very many people or generate much downstream growth. If you could hit the next slide, Billy. Liquefied natural gas. If any of you know Toby Rice, CEO of EQT, the biggest gas producer around, right? And he is a huge proponent of building up natural gas exports. Well, he may, although not to the degree that he expects to. Natural gas exports are going to continue to grow, which means more production of natural gas and more fracking in our region. But for the reasons that we've talked about, it will have almost no beneficial impact in the economy, because the problems that we've been talking about throughout this entire presentation are structural in nature. The natural gas industry is structurally incapable of generating job growth. Doesn't matter how much gas is produced. You could double the amount of gas coming out of Appalachia, and it would not increase the number of jobs. And I wish I could persuade Pennsylvania's governor to understand that. But so expecting, natural gas, LNG, to fundamentally change the dynamic, it's not going to happen. Next slide, Billy. And finally, the Arch2 hydrogen hub. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but this was the hot thing like a year or two ago, right? Since then, the Arch2 hydrogen hub has lost half of all of its projects, because they basically decided something that 3 years ago we at ORVI held a workshop for journalists in the region, and that we told them would happen. And that was that nearly all of the projects in the Appalachian Hydrogen Hub were fundamentally uneconomic. And so they're basically gone. They're waiting to see if the Trump administration will throw them any kind of a lifeline. But if they do, there may be one or two projects that survive. But fundamentally, the Arch2 Hydrogen Hub is dead. Which is a message that it's worth taking back to your local policymakers, who many of whom made a really big deal about this and all of the opportunity that it was going to bring to the region. And so, next slide, Billy. And so I'm just going to leave you with this thought, and then we can throw it open to any other questions or comments. But that is, seeing what you have today, if you were a local policymaker, would you want to place your hopes for economic recovery on the back of the natural gas industry? And would you still see it as an engine for creating jobs and prosperity? So that's what I have to show you. I'd love to answer any questions, or if there are any comments that anyone has.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sean. I will leave the last few minutes open for anyone that might have any additional questions. We greatly appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us your insights. These are definitely super valuable to our region, especially, a region that leans one way towards the industry, let's say. So yeah, thank you so much for all this
Well,
wonderful info.
yeah, I mean, hey, Natalie, one thing that I would really like to say, and I'm putting on my political hat, which is a little dangerous, but that is, so often the issues around natural gas are framed as a question of jobs versus the environment. And we know in that showdown, the environment almost always loses. But I hope the one piece of information that people come away from this with is that the jobs versus the environment frame is not even remotely accurate. Natural gas industry does not represent job creation. And anybody who says it does is either ill informed or lying. It is, and there are, and we didn't have the time or the opportunity here to get into it. There are other economic development strategies in this world that, unfortunately, because our local policymakers get distracted by the shiny object of the natural gas industry and its downstream industries like petrochemicals, which have not panned out, or other things, they fail to explore other more viable economic development
Mhm.
opportunities that are there. And that may be one of the worst consequence of all of this. And I see Michelle says, takes into account the losses due to negative. No, you're absolutely right, Michelle. It does not. And that's why I said at the beginning of this, I wanted you to take off your entire health and environmental hats and just, I mean, even on the basis of the economic impacts, would you do this?
Right. I mean, like, for the defenders of this industry who make the claims that, it is so extravagantly amazing for our region and for our county, I mean, the proof is kind of in the pudding there that, that's not necessarily the case. So,
No, and I should emphasize, in contrast to, I had mentioned the welter of economic impact studies that the industry promotes on a regular basis that we saw in all of those commercials, and which are manifestly inaccurate, by the way. The numbers that I've shown you today are not the product like those studies of modeling or projections or inference or any of that. All of the numbers that you have seen today are literally just the numbers. I once said in an interview um, that with respect to the first Frackalaccia report, I said, there's no sophisticated math going on here. These are just the numbers. And a guy named Mike Chadsey from the Ohio Oil and Gas Association seized on what I said to say, see, he admits that there's no sophisticated math going on here. And I'm going, no, that's not the point. The point is that I'm not making these things up. I'm not inferring anything. I'm not modeling anything. I'm not
these are the
projecting.
actual numbers.
These are just, you are Bill Parcells, the football coach. I know I'm always told I should not use sports analogies, but Bill Parcells, the football coach, most famously said years ago when a reporter asked him after his team was on a 3-game losing streak, he said, "Coach, do you think your team is better than its record says it is?" And Parcells gave that reporter a withering look and he said, "You are what your record says you are." Well, what you have seen today is the record of the natural gas industry. They are what their record says they are.
Exactly, exactly. Well, thank you again. Billy, if you could go to the final slide, please. So, again, I want to thank Sean O'Leary for taking the time to present, the record and setting the record straight. So, with that note, I want to inform you all of our next Lunch and Learn next next July. No, this upcoming July, next month. It's crazy that we're almost there. So on Tuesday, July 29th, we'll be having our next Lunch and Learn, and it will be featuring our summer intern class. So we'll be talking about our internship program as well as our projects that our current interns are working on. So that will be really interesting. If you know anyone that is looking for any sort of internship for class credit in college, we'll be streaming it that day, so send them the link, or we'll post it after it's been streamed, and you can send it to them afterwards, and they can get in contact with us. We're always looking to, connect with different students, and try and get them into this work because it's really great. So that is all I have today. Thank you again, Sean, for joining us. And thank you, Billy, our new comms manager, for doing the back end of things today. They are rocking it in this new role. And yeah, that is all we have today. See you all next month, and try and stay cool today. We're at a blistering 90 degrees in southwestern PA.